So when somebody comes to me as a client, one of the first things I do is work to empower them. And that means not only am I there in service to them and their growth, their healing, their realization, whatever, but I do it in such a way that they come out of each session feeling empowered rather than done to.
Hello, and welcome to our new show, Growing in the Old Ways. All the opinions expressed on this show are those of the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily express the views of Pagan Pathways Temple or its affiliates. This podcast is all about community voices. Today, we will be talking with Kenn Day. Kenn is a husband, father, author, teacher, mentor, and shaman. He has often appeared as guest of honor and teacher at the major pagan February convention, Convocation, over the years. I, Cynthia, and my husband, Howard Day, no relation to Kenn, but then who knows, we'll be talking about Post Tribal Shamanism and how it can relate to and assist with pagan and other mainstream paths. And now we present Kenn Day. Hi, this is Cynthia Day and Howard Day, and we're about to interview Kenn Day, and we're doing this by Zoom and taking the recording in on the phone for our podcast. So, hi, Kenn.
Hi.
Kenn's in Cincinnati, and we're in Dearborn Heights, Michigan.
Yes, just outside of Detroit.
Just outside of Detroit. I guess I want to...
Great Middle Eastern food there.
Oh, you got that right.
We're in the middle of it.
Yes.
And one of my very favorite Italian restaurants is up there.
Which one is that?
What is it called? Something's Cucina? Something like that?
I think I know what you're talking about. But
is it in a strip mall?
No, it's got its own little self-standing restaurant there. And Dame will meet me up there for dinner, and we'll go in. They've got like a blues guitarist sitting there on a stool. Oh, yeah. It is totally classic.
Something Cucina.
Eggplant Parmesan is amazing. Okay. So I think it's... Karina's Cucina.
Okay,
like
I think I know what he's talking
where that's
about.
at?
I think I know. I think it's on
right.
Telegraph.
I think it's right on Telegraph.
Yeah, I know where it is.
We gotta stop there.
It is so good. I'm sorry, completely threw that.
completely threw off the beginning, but that's okay.
Just messing with you, Cynthia. Hit it.
All right. So yes, we're sitting here with Kenn Day, who is a Post Tribal Shaman. And I wanted to ask you first, how did you begin as a shaman? Well,
I think that in this culture, my story isn't all that rare. Well, not that becoming a shaman isn't rare in this culture, but among those who actually are shamans, I had no idea what a shaman was until years after I had already been surviving the onslaught of it. Huh. So I started essentially running into spirits and trying to figure them out when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, as they used to say out in Arizona. But I was raised in a very fundamentalist Old Testament Christian church. And there was no place for talking to spirits. And I used to have these really intense visions of the underworld as this magenta lit vista with all these little magenta lights floating around that would talk to me. So I managed to block that out after a while. And it wasn't until I was in high school up here in Cincinnati. I moved up here after my mother died at 10. My brother died when I was 6. My mother when I was 10, and my father when I was 14. And then my sister and I, who were the surviving family, got moved up to Cincinnati to live with my mother's sister, our aunt, right? And it was, I had a wonderful case of PTSD.
Wow, that must have been
highly dissociative.
Yeah.
So that's when things started to kind of come unglued. So I think that's when my Ongong, my spirit ally, started making his presence known. I had started getting into meditation, and I would go into meditation, and I'd be sitting there minding my own business and realize, oh, there's somebody here with me. And part of me is going, well, that's not okay. You must be crazy. And part of me is like, oh, well, that's just another part of me. That's just a psychological allegory or a shadow or something. And so for years, I treated grandfather, my spirit ally, as a psychological allegory. Mm-hmm. And I got a lot of slaps in the back of the head from that. But over the years, I gradually realized, okay, it might help if I at least start treating him as if he were a separate entity with his own sentient awareness. Mm-hmm. And that has worked much better.
I can imagine, because that way you can form a real relationship.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So would you say that this is actually what the call, so to speak, to being a shaman was like for you?
Yeah, actually, because I didn't consider this shamanism until probably early 80s. I read Mircea Eliade's Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, which is this Bible-thick compendium of all these field studies done by a lot of other people that Eliade compiled and then said, oh, well, from what all these people say, we can assume that, and made all these assumptions that, many of which have been since disproven. Mm-hmm. But what it did is it showed me enough of the cultural archetypes of shamanic initiation and practice that I started going, well, this is interesting. And I was like, well, this sounds familiar. And then it was, well, this sounds uncomfortably familiar. And grandfather was just laughing. And, his idea is that I'm slow but inevitable. Kind of like a glacier.
Uh-huh.
Now, is this grandfather or is this you?
It's interesting that spirits would have a concept of time, but having to work with a human would definitely probably slow them down.
Well, only when it applies to his sense of humor and his poking at me.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. When did you first start teaching?
Oh, years after I had been practicing. First of all, my practice was initially just grandfather saying, if you did this, it would make some of that pain go away. And if you did this, you might actually be able to stay in your body a little bit longer. And so I started doing the things that he was suggesting. And amazingly, at least to me, they worked. They worked really well. And about that time, this was in the late 80s by then. So this had been about 5, 6, 8 years that I had been starting to do these practices myself and started to journey, started to realize, so I'm kind of like a shaman.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But different. Mm-hmm. So I had decided I really didn't want to be an art director because that's what I had been doing. And I left my job as an art director and went back to art school and spent 4 years getting my Bachelor of Fine Arts in drawing and painting with a certificate in creative writing and poetry, all of which I put to use on a regular basis. But, it really was an excellent education and probably the best education I was prepared to receive at the time. Mm-hmm. So there you have it. So during that time, grandfather was gradually working with me and helping me get over the worst of the PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got out of that, I was working I realized that by the end of that degree, it's like, I really don't want to go in and become a professional artist either. The politics are just ridiculous.
Really?
And so I went to work as a graphic arts supervisor, which was like a step down and 3 sideways from an art director.
Mm-hmm.
Got totally fed up with that. And eventually kind of got onto the Buddhist concept of right livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
And began to wonder, well, what would right livelihood look like for me?
Right livelihood.
Now, right livelihood. The idea behind right livelihood, as I understand it, is that right livelihood is such that you're doing something that is you. You're manifesting who you are through what you're doing. What you're doing is of service to others,
mm-hmm.
and you don't have to be anything that you're not. You don't have to put a mask on in order to do this work. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the antithesis of being an art director.
Yeah, I could see that.
So I decided, okay, well, let's see. While I was an art director, I was also doing hardstyle martial arts, and I had an instructor who suggested that, well, if you're going to be hurting people, you should probably learn how to fix them.
Yeah.
And through some weird connections through a local chiropractor, I found this Chinese doctor in Lombard, Illinois, who was looking for an apprentice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I ended up spending a lot of time on Amtrak, read a lot of books.
Mm-hmm.
So for several years, I would commute up to Lombard, Illinois, which was just west of Chicago. I'd come into Chicago and then take the L out to Lombard, get off there and walk down to Dr. Gual's house. And then he had a semi-converted garage that he would run his practice out of.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did the classic thing of, sweeping up the concrete floor,
mm-hmm.
and
wax on,
grinding
wax off.
herbs. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All the things. And I think he was really frustrated with me. And of course, I still had a lot of PTSD, so I don't even consciously remember a lot of our lessons.
Uh-huh.
But I do remember certain moments, like when he said, there are 3 kinds of doctors in China. There are worms, there are serpents, and there are dragons. I'm not even going to attempt to do his Shanghai
mm-hmm.
accent. He said, now the worms will have to look up in their books where the points are and take your pulses and look at your tongue and ask you all kinds of questions and then look up, diagnose from the book.
Mm-hmm.
The serpents will simply be able to look at your tongue, take your pulses, and then go by the bony landmarks of your body to tell where the points are, and they know, okay, because they've memorized the books.
Yeah.
I was just about to say that.
Right?
Right.
The dragons just feel the chi.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
So I, of course, being the young testosterone poisoned, PTSD-risen fellow that I was, immediately wanted to leap to dragonhood.
Yeah.
Doesn't work that way.
No.
Right. Well, and he said, you have to learn all these points, and there are hundreds and hundreds of points, and every one of them has its own name and its number, and then you have another name that where 2 things cross, and
you're talking about like acupuncture and acupressure points?
Acupuncture,
yeah.
Right. So he said, you have to learn all these points. And only when you learn them all, you will then have to forget them.
Forget everything you just learned.
Well, why not just skip right to that step?
Yeah.
So I did learn a lot of points, don't get me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very tempting to start forgetting right then.
Mm.
And I have since managed. Because remember, at the time that I was doing this, in Ohio, you had to be a licensed surgeon to perform acupuncture. You did not have to have any training in acupuncture, but you had to be a licensed surgeon. So a doctor coming here from China who had 20 years of practice in acupuncture and had taught at schools in China could be arrested for practicing medicine.
Amazing.
That's amazing.
Amazing.
That's horrible.
Could not be, it's ridiculous. But this told me that, okay, I'm never going to be practicing this. So I just did it, I did it for some friends and family, and I immediately gravitated toward Qigong anyway, which is kind of like acupuncture without the needles.
Right. Working directly
so
with
you're
the
doing
chi.
Pretty much everything that acupuncture does, except you're doing it with chi.
Right. Cool.
All right. So that was where I focused my interest, and those were the things that I remembered. Because also by the time I got back to Cincinnati and I had learned all this stuff and learned a lot about Chinese herbs and all that, I had decided that I was going to go into right livelihood, that I was going to get out of commercial art entirely, and that I was going to become a massage therapist. So I had a chum at the time who was a corporate executive, and she essentially bankrolled me going to massage school out in Lebanon, and then bought this place called the Spa, which had 3 massage treatment rooms, a spa, like a hot tub with jets, and a flotation tank.
Oh, wow.
What?
A flotation tank.
Right?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So I started working there while I was still going through massage school.
Ah.
And this was probably 3 or 4 years after, or maybe even more than that, maybe 5 years after I had stopped working with Dr. Guo in Illinois. And
I guess those would have to be really happy days. Those are good memories.
Not really. I still had really bad PTSD.
Oh, you did?
So I was struggling with depression. I still had really bad panic attacks where I would wake up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat, knowing that I was dying, and at the same time knowing that this is just a panic attack. Ken, take deep breaths, remember your training, go into solar awareness. I knew how to deal with it, and it was working, and it was much better than it used to be. But compared to now, it was still really bad. So if I was who I am now back then, I would have had some great memories. But back then, not so much. So I started, initially I was making these Chinese herbal remedies for myself and some friends. And then when I started having clients, I would say, well, if you took this bunch of herbs and stewed it up in boiling water for 15 minutes and then drank that twice a day, that would be better. And then the person would come back and say, so how was that? And I always knew if they were lying, because if they weren't lying, they'd go, oh my God, that smell was horrendous. Because the stuff smells so bad. And it stinks up the house for days. So compliance was not an easy thing to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And I finally started making tinctures. But of course, that's a lot more difficult because you have to kind of guess which particular remedies are going to be most popular, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you make up the tinctures. It takes months to make up your tinctures ahead of time. Weeks, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have a set. I had like 6 to 7, maybe a dozen tinctures at most. And those tasted awful. So it was still difficult. But then this place out in California came online that offered tinctures of all the remedies. And so I haven't made a single remedy or Chinese tea since.
Mm.
But once again, that's a tangent. But
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of where I was, and I was starting to work with clients, doing hands-on work, doing Swedish massage, and I would find that I was working in some Qigong, and everybody seemed to like that. And then I noticed that I was doing some other stuff. And I realized, I'm actually taking the practices that grandfather has had me do for myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm applying them over here on my clients.
Mm-hmm.
And so after about a year, I had a repeat rate of like 98%.
Oh, wow. That's
so
really good.
98% of all the people who scheduled with me would come back for at least one more visit.
Uh-huh. That's great.
That's fantastic.
That was great. Unfortunately, the 3 or 4 massage therapists who work for us had a retention rate of about 20%.
Oh, dear.
Oh, boy.
So all of, I was putting money into, remember the Yellow Pages?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
you're
was
dating
putting
us
money
now.
You're right. There was a Yellow Page ad. There was advertising, local newspapers, all that kind of stuff. And so about 40% of my income was going to support their practices,
Mm-hmm.
because they weren't having that retention rate. So I began to think, I think I need to go off on my own. And I was getting more and more into doing Qigong and doing the shamanic stuff. And so right about that time, my partner was thinking, this really isn't working for me. I said, okay, well, maybe you should sell it. And she did. So we sold the business. I graduated with my certificate, went through the state medical board exams and got my license and everything, and went into practice on my own. And it was probably 2 or 3 years after that. That was in 89, 90. And probably about 3 years after that is when I finally started referring to myself as a shaman. Mm-hmm. After kind of going through, I guess I'm kind of a neo-shaman or a urban shaman, or
Mm-hmm.
and grandfather just laughing at me and telling me I was stupid and say, no, you're a shaman and you need to stop making an ass of yourself and just recognize what you are and move forward.
Mm-hmm.
So at some point I was up at Convocation, as you are familiar,
mm-hmm.
and there was a shaman there who was Mongolian, and her name, see if I can remember this, was Saren Garel.
Okay.
And I thought, oh wow, that's cool. This is a real shaman. So unfortunately our workshops were booked opposite each other.
Mm-hmm. As usually happens there.
As happens, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So we wound up meeting up after one of our workshops and hanging out in the workshop space after the workshop was over.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was a lunch break or something. So we spent a good couple hours just chatting and getting to know each other and, popping up medicine body and whatever it is she was working with. It's like, wow, that's really impressive. And she was saying, what's your perspective on the soul? I said, well, you mean the souls? And she said, yes. And
the souls.
So we had this great time. She said, well, I need to go. I have an appointment with somebody. She was on a panel or something, I guess. I said, okay, well, it was nice meeting you. She says, it's nice meeting you too. I'm so glad that they have at least one real shaman here.
Wow.
Wow. Thank you.
I guess it takes one to know one.
Apparently. So that felt good. And that kind of, once again, grandfather was laughing his head off. That was the point where I realized, okay, so maybe what I'm doing actually is shamanism and not just me making stuff up. Mm-hmm. So that was really the beginning of it for me.
Can you go into what the three souls are?
Sure, I would be happy to. So the way grandfather likes to tell it is that when we are born, we have an upper world soul that I call the celestial soul, and we have a lower world soul that I call the ancestral soul. Mm-hmm. And the ancestral soul is like a communal soul that includes all of our blood ancestors going way back into the mist of time. It's like ancestor soup. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then just like soup, we'll have chunks floating in it. You know, this soup has more recent ancestors, you know, people who have died just recently, and even people who are alive. Okay. And then the upper world soul, the celestial soul, is the soul that has had all these past lifetimes. Right? And is now coming into this one. So when you are conceived, the ancestral soul can come in and out of the womb as the fetus develops. And that's how you feel connected to your ancestors. And then with the first breath that you take after birth, okay, that first breath after the midwife slaps you on the ass, you breathe in that celestial soul. And that's when these two souls come together, and they, in turn, create your earthly soul, which is the one that manifests as who you are in this lifetime.
Ah. You know, that explains a lot now.
How so?
So, and that shows up. I mean, that's not just Post Tribal Shamanism. You'll see in myriad traditions all over the world. You know, Hebrew spirituality, you have the Nefesh, the Neshama, and the Ruach, right? Mm-hmm. And in various traditions, you have three different souls or three different soul pieces. Now, some, you have like 8 or 9 or 11 or 12 different souls. In Post-Tribal Shamanism, it's like, well, we've got these 3, and then some people have some other bits and pieces. Mm-hmm. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yes. It does. But I was wondering, can you go into what post-tribal shamanism really is?
Oh, yes. So back when I was trying to make sense of just what kind of shaman I was, I was very clear, thanks to grandfather, that I was not a Native American shaman, and that, in fact, there were very few of those, that I was not a Amazonian shaman, that I was not any kind of shaman from any kind of indigenous tradition, but that we really needed to respect and honor those traditions and our spiritual ancestors who worked those traditions. And so I needed to come up with a term that acknowledged that what I was doing was shamanism, but also acknowledged and honored the difference. And the primary difference, as grandfather would say, is that in in traditional shamanism, let's say, traditional shamanism arises in tribal cultures for the most part. And in a tribal culture, the primary unit of that culture is the tribe, the commune, right? And so any individual within that communal structure will see themselves first as that communal self, and only secondarily or tertiarily as an individual. Okay? So, and in a way, this is a reflection of our own ancestral soul. Because when we're born, our awareness is more of that communal state that arises in the ancestral soul. And so they've even done studies of this where they'll take a mother and child, a little baby going all the way up until like 18 months of age, and they'll sit the mama and the child down in front of a mirror, and they'll put some rouge, some lipstick on the baby's nose, right? And the baby looks in the mirror, sees the rouge or the lipstick on their nose, and try to wipe it off mama's nose.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they don't yet differentiate themselves from the parents, from the ancestors.
That is intense.
Okay?
Yeah.
Well, that is how tribal works. So, for instance, if I was a tribal shaman, if I was a shaman of a tribal community, and say you were all in my tribe, right? And I knew that Howard was having some bad dreams, and that he'd been having bad dreams for weeks. Okay? Maybe I heard about it at the marketplace, maybe, who knows? But I don't even have to go and talk to Howard about this, because I can feel it, because I'm part of this whole too. And his part of the whole is creating this disturbance and is really beginning to bug his neighbors. So I journey, I go to the ancestors, they tell me, well, you know, Howard has not been making his offerings to his ancestors. And so we've been bothering him and everybody else. Like, oh, I go to Howard, I say, Howard, you forgot to do your offerings. We need to do this cleansing ritual and everything is going to be fine. Right? If Cynthia, if you wanted to do soul retrieval, if you had been down at the river getting water and got attacked by a wild animal and escaped with your life, but have been traumatized, then I would go and retrieve the lost part of your essence and bring it back to you and reintegrate it for you. Because that's my job, because I am that part of the whole as a shaman.
I see.
And you would be able to sense this through the chi of everybody in the tribe.
Right, because we share that egregore, that group communal consciousness.
Yeah, that's...
In our highly individualized civilization, society, it would be completely inappropriate for me to act in that way. You know, for me to go and journey to Howard's ancestors and say, wow, you really screwed up there. You haven't been doing... No, he didn't ask me for that. Or for me to journey and do a soul retrieval for you when you didn't ask me for that. How disempowering. So when somebody comes to me as a client, one of the first things I do is work to empower them. And that means not only am I there in service to them and their growth, their healing, their realization, whatever, but I do it in such a way that they come out of each session feeling empowered rather than done to.
Where they're in charge of the process, right?
Exactly. So, for instance, when somebody comes for a soul retrieval, they go on the journey with me. Okay, so I do the part that they're not, ready to do, but they still go and they directly encounter those lost parts of their essence, and they bring them back and they integrate them.
Now, you've talked about soul retrieval, but in one of your books, you had a term called soul wound. And I was wondering why in shamanism ancestors are so important, and what is the soul wound?
Wow, I don't actually remember what what I wrote about that. You mean the invisible wound?
The invisible wound.
Yeah,
yes.
That's it.
Oh,
the invisible soul wound. That's how you wrote it.
That I remember. Okay, so the invisible wound is something really both subtle and pervasive. All right. When you look at the fact that all of us are born with these different souls and with this hardwired sense of communal connection, right? Mm-hmm. And then we're born into this culture where we don't have any connection with each other, right?
Right.
We are so disconnected, disenfranchised.
And
it's very
we glorify the individual here in Western society.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is the culture of the rugged individualist. Mm-hmm. That is our cultural icon. And that is the antithesis. I mean, that is actually the icon of the invisible wound. Because the invisible wound is the wound between the individual and the communal.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes all the way back to the wound between, this goes back to the first teaching that I remember receiving from grandfather, which was, there is only one center.
Mm-hmm.
It just happens to be everywhere.
Yeah.
Very Zen, right?
Yes, very Zen. I get it, but yes, it's very Zen.
Right.
But sometimes the concepts are so different than what you come up with. It's one of those things where I think I understand that concept, but I'm wondering if I'm getting it right. I guess that only takes time.
Well, if you look at it like, you know, in the beginning or before the beginning, there's the one, and everything is the one. Mm-hmm. There is nothing else. There's the one that's kind of floating there in the void, and then the one sees its reflection in the void and has a startle response that has it leap away from its reflection, thus moving from oneness into duality. Mm-hmm. And it runs away from itself as far as it can, but remember, it's still one. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like pulling a rubber band. And eventually you pulled it as far as you can and it begins to draw back. So you have this duality that has manifested as a polarization of that oneness. Mm-hmm. And so instead of one, it's turned into matter and energy, light and dark, male and female. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then as it comes back together, it begins to experience desire, that desire for union. Mm-hmm. And it comes in and there's this expectation of reunion, and instead it runs into its polarized opposite. And in that moment, energy experiences for the first time the sense of containment, being contained within matter. Mm-hmm. And inert matter experiences for the first time the force of energy acting upon it. And these two experiences are one. And that experience is the root of consciousness. Mm-hmm. It's the root of the subject-object relationship of consciousness. And from that, everything else arises.
Okay. And the ancestors?
And the ancestors arise from that too.
Yes. Wow.
But that movement from the one into duality is the root of the invisible wound. Mm-hmm. Okay. And ultimately, there is no way to heal that wound within duality, because the nature of duality, the nature of the finite universe, is a wounded state. So the only way that we can address that effectively is to be simultaneously in that wounded state and in the unwounded state of oneness at once. So it's a little bit like, rubbing your head and patting your stomach at the same time.
That I can understand.
That you get?
That I can understand.
Okay. Can we go into the world tree a little bit? Because that's an archetype that seems to span so many different pagan religions and different religions in the world, as a matter of fact.
Well, consider that. Okay, so Mircea Eliade was one of those people who used to think, put out the thought that most world religions are based on shamanism. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, that's probably not all that valid. But what is true is that most, probably all human spiritual traditions arose from something called animism, which is also at the root of shamanism. Mm-hmm. And animism is the radical notion that everything, every object, every plant, every tree, every mountain,
every bit of existence,
every rock,
yes,
is alive and imbued with spirit.
Oddly enough, I believe that. I have as a child, ever since then.
There you go. But that's where all these other things came from. So if you think about this is something I like to do with one of my workshops, is I get people starting to perceive objects. And this is especially true with our shamanic tools. Mm-hmm. I said we have certain significant objects in our lives. And if we look at these objects and begin to build a relationship with the spirit of that object, then it comes alive to us.
It could be anything. A tree.
A cup. Yeah.
Right.
Anything.
Yeah.
A drum, a portaba, all these things. So I have people start off with just one. They choose a tool or a cup or whatever, mm-hmm. and then gradually work up from there. But the world tree is a very unique manifestation of the one. Because in a way, the world tree is that, that moment when the one split apart and became duality? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly.
Tree.
Exactly. That stretching is the world tree. So if you stretch that out, you have the upper world, you have the lower world, you have a middle world. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, the middle world is incredibly sacred, divine, because the middle world is a reflection of the one.
And it's where all the energy is.
It's where all the energy is?
When you think about it.
Well, there's energy in all three.
Mm-hmm. But that's like the point where everything's being pulled from.
Yeah.
To make it there. So it's a catalyst point, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mystery.
Yeah.
With a capital M.
Mm-hmm.
And then the world tree is that axis mundi between the worlds.
Mm.
The world tree is of all three worlds. And the shaman is like the world tree in that we are also of all three worlds. We humans, all humans, are of all three worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Other animals don't have an upper world soul and a lower world soul. They just have the lower world soul.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that upper world soul, that celestial soul, that makes us different.
Oh, okay. Well, I hadn't encountered that, but yeah, that sort of makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And that's as far as we know, because we have yet to encounter all life on the planet.
And I'm just passing on what I get from grandfather, mind you.
Mm-hmm.
So, There are other teachings out there that will contradict this, but it is in line with most teachings that you'll run into of a shamanic nature.
When you speak of the invisible wound, what are some of the manifestations of the invisible wound in society?
Yeah. Well, on one hand, pretty much everything you see when you look out at our culture, the fascination with superficial things, appearance,
materialism,
bright lights, materialism. And then at a lower level, all of the addictions. Addiction is really the urge of the self to reach out to find something that can fill this aching void that comes from that invisible wound. It's a sense that we're missing something that we expected to be there. We're missing that sense of profound connection, that absolute certainty that we are one with others. So one of the things that people encounter in my workshops right from the beginning is they begin to experience that sense of communal awareness. They begin to encounter the rest of their cohort as a communal soul.
And they feel at home.
Exactly. They feel welcomed. They feel accepted. They feel that sense of communal awareness. And this is tremendously soothing to the ego, and at the same time, extremely transformative, and to many people, terrifying.
Really? Because the ego, the ego is part of the what you said earlier, if I'm getting it right, is that the ancestral self and the celestial self sort of make this egoic center for us to experience here on Earth. And then when you realize the communal connection, the ego is threatened because it's not it's not all alone by itself anymore. And it has to undergo a kind of transformation, I take it, in awareness.
Yeah. Well, consider when we're born, we're kind of shoved out of that communal relationship with the ancestral self, with the ancestral soul. And everything out here is constantly teaching us that we are an individual, that we are alone, that is just us. And any time that we kind of point back to that communal experience, our parents, our friends, our teachers, society at large, all tells us that that's just childish. And what it means by that is that that's not okay. You need to grow out of that.
Oh, that individuation that everyone's trying to do.
Exactly.
Yes.
So having accomplished that, having become a competent adult individual in our culture, and then suddenly being reintroduced to that communal state that you're desperately hungry for, is rather threatening to a lot of people.
They don't know how
because they've built up their identity on being an individual, and they feel swallowed up, I guess is the word.
They're losing their identity.
The ego would feel swallowed up.
Yeah, they lose their identity. They lose their sense of identity and self-worth.
Except they don't. They're afraid they will.
But they
I'll tell you this right now. Nobody who's come to any of my workshops and gone through this has lost their identity. All right? They all come out of it with their egos intact. But it's the fear of the ego, because the ego is told that it is the only part that is real. And so it thinks, well, I must be going crazy because I'm having this very vivid experience of a sense of self that is much larger than just me. Now, mind you, a lot of people also have that same experience and go, oh my God, that's my flannel jammies. That's right where I want to be.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I would like that.
But some are threatened. Yeah.
Huh. Wow. Okay. Reintegration with the self. Shadow work. Can we go into some of that?
Going really diving deep now.
Oh yes. When I study something, I sometimes get deep.
Well, when I do my workshop series, there's a reason why the shadow work is after almost 2 years of in-depth work, because every one of the teachings is based on the previous ones. So we start off by introducing you to the communal self and to soul awareness and to your shamanic body, the part of you that can journey into other realms. Okay. And then we go from there. We build up on that by, working with spirits, working with medicine body, working with dream body, okay, and learning healing technique, learning how to perceive others and work with others energetically and at a soul level. And then we work with the invisible wound. And then we do work with shadows.
Because shadows are bits of the self that you've disowned, as I understand it.
Yeah. The shadow is a part of self that we have, for one or another reason, either dissociated from, said, you are not me, or simply it's never occurred to us that this part of us is us. Or cultural mores, expectations, societal rules and such have suppressed those parts of us so that they don't come up to a conscious level of awareness. And all of those are constantly impacting our personality, our actions, our thoughts. Okay, so for instance, you're 3 years old and you just made the best drawing ever, and you run to find mama to show her the picture you just drew, and you run into the kitchen and mom is standing at the stove stirring something and looking up the recipe and trying to do 6 things at once, and you come running up and start tugging at her apron, and she yells at you and says, I don't have time for you right now. And your poor little heart is broken because she's always supposed to be there for you. And so within yourself, you go, oh, she doesn't like it when I need attention. Well, then I don't need attention. Because after all, you're 3 years old. What are you going to do? If mama doesn't love you, you can't exactly go out and get a job and support yourself, get your own place. You need her. It's a survival level mechanism.
So you have to conform to what you're perceiving.
Exactly. You conform by excising this part of yourself that you perceive as unacceptable. Now, that doesn't mean that you magically stop needing attention. It just means that you are no longer capable of consciously acknowledging that you need attention. And so instead, you go through life and you find new and interesting ways to act out that get attention without you having to acknowledge that you wanted the attention. So, you're a freshman in college and you're going to Kagers and dancing with a lampshade on your head. and engaging in risky behavior because we're still being impacted by those shadows.
Yeah.
So the shadow work is one of going to find where those shadows are, engage with them, acknowledge them, see them, accept them, and integrate them into our whole self. At which point they just become something you're consciously aware of. Suddenly you are aware. Well, of course, I need attention. I want attention. And that's okay. And then your conscious self can go, yeah, it's okay to need attention, and there are appropriate ways to go about getting it. And the lampshade is used only for special situations.
Because the shadow itself wishes to return to the true self. Yes?
Well, the shadow itself doesn't necessarily have a whole lot, depending on how big it is, a whole lot of its own awareness. Remember, some of these shadow fragments are so small and disintegrated that they don't really have so much of a sense of awareness. It's more like a thorn in your shoe.
Okay. What?
I was just going to ask about the subject of journeying. I remember reading about your first time that you journeyed. And I'm wondering, is this something that just someone could start via a daily regimen of meditation or something like that? Because sometimes finding a teacher is difficult, or finding someone to aid you in the journey.
It is. And I will say that, I've been teaching now for well over 30 years. And my hope is that over that time I've become a better and better teacher, because I certainly had a long way to go. And one of the things that, I'll go back to when I met Sarah and Garrel. And actually, she said some things about journeying that really rang true to me and were very much like my experience of journeying. But there was also another shaman that I ran into at a retreat center up in Colorado who was from Peru, Peruvian shaman or elder of some sort, maybe not a shaman. And it was interesting. He didn't have any English, and his Spanish was much better than my Spanish. But somehow we managed to communicate well enough to kind of recognize each other. When I went into medicine body, he was like, oh, and I started just jabbering away. And then he basically went into medicine body and go, whoa. And I was all excited. So we hugged each other, and I gave him a copy of my book and went off. But one of the things that he managed to get across to me is that he was teaching, and that people at this workshop that he was teaching there couldn't get out of their heads, that they weren't going on a journey, they were just in their heads. And I'd run into this before talking to other indigenous shamans. And this is what my experience was as well. That when I encountered, for instance, people with the core shamanic, Michael Heiner's group, and this was back in the early 80s, late 70s, when it was first getting started, their sense of shamanic journeying was really just creative visualization. And I found that most people here in the West have kind of an unconscious belief that all shamanic journeying is creative visualization. And that's very difficult to dispel. So one of the first things I have them do when people come into my classes to have them visualize a big oak tree.
Mm-hmm.
And they get it nice and solid. So, okay, move that about 6 feet to the left. And they move it. Okay, great. Now let's go into shamanic body. Go into shamanic body, go into lodge. There's the world tree. Have them go up, introduce them to the world tree. Okay, now move that 6 feet to the left. Right.
They can't do it.
I've yet to find a single person who can move the world tree, including myself.
Okay.
You know, and this brings up a really important element, and that is discernment. Okay? Discernment is so essential to this kind of work because it's very tempting to believe that anything we imagine is real. And it's not. When we're journeying, we are often at the mercy of our egoic soul. And what I mean by that is the egoic soul is the part of us that is kind of operating the hardware. All right? The egoic soul, the mind, is looking at the input it's getting from our shamanic body and trying to make sense of that. And if it wants to communicate with us visually, then it gives us images. But the image is not the thing. The map is not the territory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The world tree is not a tree. It is a mystery. It is that which connects the three worlds. For those of us who receive the data, that data is translated into information by our minds through visual images, we may see an image of the world tree. And that's very helpful for us. It helps us navigate through that world. Myself, I'm primarily kinesthetic. I feel the world tree. I know where it is, but I don't see it visually.
Okay.
But it's very important because our minds are also great storytellers.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. The nature of the ego is to tell stories. Any time that we encounter something that we don't understand, we begin to tell ourselves stories about it.
We label it.
We begin to try to explain it.
Yeah, we label it.
Would we be better off to not try to explain it and just experience it?
But how are we going to do that? It takes a lot of practice. Right now, that's where we're at. Okay? So it's very important to be able to recognize the difference between what my mind is telling me about what's here in this space with my shamanic body, on the journey, in other words, and what's something that my ego trying to make up a story about this experience. All right? So it's so important to know how to be able to go into that part of the self. I call it the observer mind after the Buddhist practice. The part of ourselves that is the observer. And this is what we do in meditation practice. Okay, so when we're meditating, we sit, we go into observer mind, and we observe the thoughts that arise. And as the thought arises, we observe it. We don't engage it. We don't think the thought. We simply observe the thought and go, oh, that's a thought. And as we observe the thought, because we're not engaging it, the thought is ungrounded and it dissolves.
Okay. I can understand that.
All right?
Yeah,
Okay.
does that kind of help with your problems with meditation, you think?
Well, yeah, because my issue was, I tried meditation a few times. And I was just getting thoughts I just didn't understand. And then you came to Convocation a few years ago, and you led a group of us on a journey with Grandfather. And I was getting just visions and thoughts that I just didn't understand. They didn't make any sense to me at that time. But now I'm beginning to think that maybe it's just lack of contact with our ancestor selves. We're just not
used to it.
We're just not used to it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We don't have a context.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
I don't have a context for it. And so maybe, if it ever happens again, maybe I should just say, okay, that happened. Write it down if I could remember it and move on.
Or just recognize that it might just be your ego telling you stories.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Most of our thoughts are just our egos telling us stories. And if we sit there and observe our mind and observe our thoughts, all the thoughts dissolve. And then once the tendency of the brain to keep tossing out new thoughts begins to quiet, then we can seek the source of these thoughts. We can kind of follow their path back to where they came from.
Okay.
But when we find that source, what we discover is something that can be a little bit unsettling. What we discover is emptiness. Vast emptiness. And what's important here is to not get stuck on the emptiness, because that's only one aspect of it. Because this emptiness is filled with awareness. But the awareness that fills that emptiness is not the conscious awareness of our brain, but the non-dual awareness, the soul awareness of our deeper, non-individuated self.
Wow. Wow, I'd like
so
to get down to that.
So when we observe that,
uh-huh.
when we observe the qualities of that, for instance, we're still an observer mind, we observe the emptiness, we observe the awareness, we observe that the awareness and the emptiness are like two sides of the same coin, they're in union. And then we notice that there's this field of luminous awareness. And when we observe this field of luminous awareness, we notice that it has a quality of stillness. Now, unlike our thoughts, when observer mind directs its attention onto this quality of stillness, it does not dissolve.
It remains.
It remains because it's
exactly.
real.
It persists.
Because it's real.
Exactly. When we observe the quality of silence in this luminous field of soul awareness, it does not dissolve. It persists.
So then we have discernment.
Take this same quality, this same capacity of discernment, and we bring this through those inner doorways into shamanic body when we're journeying. And when we're in shamanic body, we go up and we meet the world tree and we observe the world tree in whatever way we observe it, whether it's kinesthetic, whether it's visual, whatever. We observe it, it does not dissolve.
Okay.
And then somebody points to a big purple dragon kind of waving around in the room, and we observe that, and poof, it dissolves. Okay? So immediately we have a tremendously essential tool for discernment within the context of journeying.
Yep. All right.
Okay.
That is awesome. Right. That is very deep and very awesome. And it's going to take me a while to process that and make sure I've got it.
I think you've just made one fantastic advertisement for a regimen of daily meditation.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I like to think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I recommend to all of my students daily meditation. I actually have a audio file on Insight app. You can get the app on your smartphone, and they have all these teachers, all these free meditations. And I'm one of those teachers. And there's a meditation on there that's called Resting in Soul Awareness. And it's a 20-minute meditation that leads you through that practice of moving from observer mind, observing the thoughts, into that emptiness, and through that into the luminous field of soul awareness.
What's it called again?
Resting in Soul Awareness.
Resting in Soul Awareness.
And what's that app again?
It's an app. That's the name of the app.
No, it's not.
No. The name of the app is Insight Timer app.
Insight Timer?
Insight
Timer app.
Okay.
I will look that up, and maybe some of our listeners will look that up too and learn something really
I hope
useful.
so. I can, it's always nice to meet up with new people on there.
Oh yeah. Okay.
But the app is free and the meditation is free.
Very good. Well, I remember reading at the end of your book, Post Tribal Shamanism, and when you were speaking of the one at the end of the book, that it generates bliss, joy, and compassion, profound connection and well-being, and communion, but it doesn't project fear, hatred, or rage.
Right.
And that when we're in our daily practice, I guess, is when you were saying this, that we are to sense the source and bask in that light.
Yes.
Yes.
And once you experience that soul awareness, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And I guess
because that is there.
I guess anyone on any pagan path or any path could make use of this.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of the roots of spirituality in any practice.
Mm-hmm.
If you read the Upanishads, which were written probably 7,000 years ago, and when you read translations of them today, it sounds like they're talking about the same thing that we experience when we go into soul awareness now. So this has been around since humans have been around.
And now
that's
it's
something
going
that's
around.
Very important for people to realize.
And now it's going around a little bit more. Hopefully
our awareness is returning to it.
We can hope. We can only hope.
One thing I would like to mention, and that is that people seem to have some, let's say a spectrum of definitions for what a shaman is.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to adhere to the definition that you'll find with indigenous shamans, traditional shamans, and people who have been studying shamanism for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that a shaman is somebody who is, first of all, chosen by the spirits in order to go into intentional trance states that allow them to enter the spirit realm, to communicate with spirits, to negotiate, to bring back information, and to cause changes, all in service to others.
Yes, I can see that. Also, elsewhere in your book, you mentioned that one of the jobs of a shaman is to be a provocateur, an instigator that moves people into awareness and changes their resonance, and their resonance in in turn changes the resonance of the world, of the people around them.
You know, it's not so much a part of the job title as much as it's a part of how things work.
Oh, okay.
You've probably noticed that when you go through changes, it changes how others see you and respond to you.
True.
And when you start to resonate with those changes and you're on a path, a journey of transformation and healing and growth, that creates a resonance that will tend to provoke a similar response in others.
Yeah, like two tuning forks. One fork that's hit
exactly
will cause the other to resonate at the same sound.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
We're also like that.
So a shaman, that's what we do. And so that resonance is strong. And of course, as a shaman, you have to be doing your own work. If I stop doing my own work, if I stop waking up in the morning and going and meditating and chanting and drumming and doing all the things that I need to do to maintain my own journey, then I'm no longer a shaman.
Yeah,
because
I can see that.
All I'm doing is flapping my gums.
Yeah, you have to be in touch.
And you have to make sure that everything is aligned within you before you can help others.
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely not perfect. Perfection is...
we almost lost your sound.
Not attainable. Oh, hold on a second.
Okay.
We can cut this part. Here we go.
Okay.
There. Is that better?
That's much better.
Okay. Yeah, my AirPods ran out of battery.
Oh, they died. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So, where were we?
I got distracted by the pods.
Right.
We were talking about how it is a shaman has to stay in touch with himself and the spirits.
Right. Being in touch with yourself and doing your own work does not mean that we ever attain perfection. Okay, right. Perfection, the only way to attain perfection is be in that state of oneness all the time. And while there are mystics that actually work toward that, and that is their goal, the shaman's perspective is a little different. We're more focused on being in touch with that state and allowing that state to inform our everyday life. But we also want to be able to safely handle heavy equipment and, take out the garbage, do the dishes without breaking too many.
You have to have a foot in both worlds.
Exactly. And so a lot of my practice is about integrating that into my everyday life.
Okay.
And it doesn't always look perfect. Right now I'm going through a healing crisis with my left eye. I really don't see much of anything out of my left eye right now. And Grandfather's been very clear that everything's fine. Everything is just fine, and I just need to move along. Keep going on the journey. Keep doing my practices. Do what I need to do, and everything's going to be fine. So that's what I've been doing.
Okay.
It definitely makes for an interesting journey.
Yes, it does.
Incredible journey. You have been on some incredible journeys, and I can only hope to maybe go on a journey like that myself sometime and reinstate my meditation practice and stay in tune with myself.
Well, it definitely is not boring.
No, it's not. A lot of people think meditation is, but it's not boring at all. It is a very active process.
Yes.
And if you think it can't help you, just remember that according to certain sources, Steve Jobs came out with most of the iPhone and iPod during meditation.
Is that true?
Yes.
I didn't know
He
that.
meditated quite often.
Wow.
Yes. So there's another advertisement for meditation.
Okay, yeah, maybe it can make you rich. Well, I want to thank you, Ken, for spending this time with us. Yes. Thank you so much.
Is it okay if I give a little advertisement for my workshops?
Please do. Please.
Okay, because I only have an in-person workshop right now down here in Cincinnati, and I am getting one of those started again. I'm getting a new Cincinnati cohort started next month. Don't have an exact date, but I've got it up on...
and next month is September of 2020.
September of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly after that, I will also be beginning a new online cohort. So this is one of the changes wrought by COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
For a couple months there, I couldn't see anybody in person. And so the group that was meeting here in Cincinnati became an online group. And it worked so well that I finally decided to get over my disbelief in the idea that online could be effective and do an online cohort, and it's worked out quite well. So I'm starting a new one coming up in probably October of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
So if anyone's interested in that, and then I'm hoping to do an in-person workshop again, probably either down around Georgia or up in the Detroit area. I do have a place in Dearborn Heights where I do plan on coming back and doing another in-person series.
Cool.
After COVID-19 settles down, we'll see. And of course, I have my books out there, I think both of which are holding up pretty well. And then I've got my private practice here in Cincinnati and online. Been doing probably about 50% of my clientele right now is remote through Zoom or Skype or the telephone. And I'm constantly amazed at how well this spiritual technology works over digital. So,
yeah, that is surprising.
I'm stunned.
Yes. That is surprising.
I'm stunned that this works
Well,
well.
I'm going to call that a day for Growing in the Old Ways.
Call it a wrap. And
call it a wrap.
Please let me know when it comes out, and I look forward to listening.
Certainly. All right.
Promoting.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Growing in the Old Ways. And we will have more for you next week or so.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
This episode of PPT Presents is brought to you by Pagan Pathways Temple. Pagan Pathways Temple is a 501c3 out of beautiful Madison Heights, Michigan. We offer classes, both online and in person, community outreach, ritual space, and a library available to our members. To find out more, or to become a member, please go to paganpathwaystemple.org or patreon.com/Pagan Pathways Temple. Pagan Pathways Temple, growing in the old ways where all paths are open.
This PPT Presents broadcast is brought to you by TechWitch Detroit. TechWitch Detroit for all your IT needs. Please visit us on the web at techwitchdetroit.com. TechWitch Detroit, we can help.